Karen had been a nightmare for years. She wasn't just any HOA board member. She was the self-appointed enforcer of the most ridiculous rules imaginable. Trash cans left out for more than 30 minutes? Fine. Lawn not cut to exactly 2.5 inches? Fine. Holiday decorations up one day past the approved period? Fine. She loved her power, and no one could tell her otherwise. But her worst mistake was coming after my service dog. The day it all started, Karen's unbelievable demand. I had lived in the neighborhood for 3 years without issue. I kept my home pristine, followed all reasonable HOA rules, and never caused problems. The only thing that set me apart, I had a service dog named Baxter. Baxter wasn't just a pet, he was my lifeline. As a disabled veteran, I relied on him for mobility assistance and medical alerts. He was certified, trained, and legally protected under the Americans with Disabilities Act (ADA). And for the first few years, no one had ever questioned him. Until Karen got involved. They got a letter that started it all. One morning, I checked my mailbox and saw an envelope from the HOA. Inside, a formal violation notice with bold red letters at the top. Immediate action required, pet policy violation. I read further. Dear homeowner, it has come to our attention that you are in violation of the HOA's strict no-pet policy. Dogs are not permitted under community guidelines. This includes service animals or therapy dogs. You are required to remove the animal from your property within 7 days or face daily fines of $200 and possible legal action. Sincerely, Karen L. Patterson, HOA Compliance Officer. I had to reread it 3 times just to process the absurdity. Karen wasn't just ignoring the law, she was deliberately breaking it. I knew exactly what she was trying to do. She assumed I was just another homeowner she could bully into submission. She thought I would give in, panic, and get rid of Baxter. But what she didn't know, I wasn't just a disabled veteran. I was also a licensed disability rights attorney, and I was about to ruin her entire career. My first response, a warning Karen should have listened to. I immediately drafted a response and hand-delivered it to the HOA office. It read, "To whom it may concern, this notice is in violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA, and the Fair Housing Act, FHA. As a service animal, my dog is legally protected, and I have full documentation to prove it. Your attempt to enforce the no-pet policy against a federally protected service dog is illegal. I strongly suggest you withdraw this violation notice immediately before legal action is pursued. Sincerely, my name." I handed it to the HOA receptionist and said, "Give this to Karen and tell her she has 48 hours to drop this nonsense." She nervously took the letter and nodded. I thought that would be the end of it. I thought Karen would back down. I was so wrong. Karen's next move, the outrageous HOA meeting. Instead of admitting her mistake, Karen doubled down. She called an emergency HOA meeting to discuss service dog compliance. I attended, expecting some kind of resolution. Instead, I walked into a full-blown interrogation. Karen sat at the head of the table, smirking like she had already won. She cleared her throat and said, "Before we begin, let me remind everyone, this is a private community with strict regulations." Then she turned to me and continued, "I understand you claim to have a service dog, but the HOA has determined that your animal is disruptive and does not comply with our rules." I raised an eyebrow. The HOA has determined? Since when does the HOA override federal law? Karen ignored me. "We don't allow animals of any kind. That includes special exceptions." I pulled out my ADA documentation and slid it across the table. "That's not how the law works. My service dog is protected under federal law. You have no authority to overrule that." Karen glanced at the paperwork, but didn't even read it. Then she said something that shocked everyone in the room. "Well, we don't recognize the ADA here." Dead silence. Even the other board members looked uncomfortable. I stared at her and said, "Say that again." Slowly, Karen crossed her arms. "The HOA rules are more important than government rules." At that moment, I knew. She was completely beyond reasoning. So I smiled, stood up, and said, "I'll see you in court." Karen laughed. "You wouldn't dare." She had no idea who she was dealing with, because the moment I walked out of that meeting, I filed a federal lawsuit against the HOA, the lawsuit that changed everything. Within 48 hours, my lawyer officially served the HOA with legal documents. Karen had gone from smirking in a boardroom to panicking in a courtroom. Because now, she wasn't just fighting me. She was facing the Department of Justice, and things were about to get very bad for her. Karen had made two major mistakes. She thought HOA rules were more powerful than federal law. She picked a fight with the wrong homeowner. Now, she wasn't just dealing with an annoyed neighbor. She was facing a full-scale lawsuit, and she had no idea what was coming next. The HOA's initial response, pure denial. When Karen and the HOA board were officially served with my lawsuit, I expected them to panic and back down. But instead, they doubled down on their stupidity. The HOA's lawyer, some mid-tier real estate attorney who probably regretted taking the case, sent me a ridiculous response. It stated, the HOA has the right to enforce all community rules, including pet bans. Federal guidelines do not apply to private homeowner associations. I nearly laughed out loud when I read it. They were actually trying to argue that the ADA and Fair Housing Act didn't apply to them. This was like arguing that gravity didn't exist. And the best part, they had just handed me the easiest court victory ever. The day gets involved, Karen realizes she's in trouble. Instead of responding directly, I forwarded their nonsensical legal argument straight to the Department of Justice, DOJ, and the Fair Housing Administration. Within a week, a formal federal investigation was launched. A DOJ representative personally called the HOA's attorney and said, "You are violating federal law. Reverse your policy immediately or face legal consequences." And how did Karen respond? By ignoring it. She actually told the HOA board members that the DOJ wasn't serious and that we should fight back. Her arrogance knew no bounds. So I gave her one last warning. I sent a letter to the HOA stating, "This is your final chance to comply with federal law. If you do not revoke your violation notice, I will pursue the full extent of legal damages. You have 48 hours. Karen's response? She shredded the letter in front of the HOA board. One member later told me, "She said you were bluffing." Big mistake. Because the moment that deadline passed, I took her straight to court. The court date, Karen faces the judge. A few weeks later, we all arrived at the federal courthouse. Karen walked in smirking, still thinking she was in control. But when the judge read the case details, his expression changed instantly. "Ms. Patterson, are you aware that you are in direct violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act?" Karen crossed her arms. "Your Honor, we are a private community, and we have the right to enforce our own rules." The judge sighed. "That's not how the law works." Then he turned to me and said, "Counselor, do you have documentation proving that your service dog is legally protected?" I nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. I have full ADA certification, medical necessity letters, and previous case law supporting my claim." I handed over a stack of evidence. The judge flipped through the pages, then looked back at Karen. "Ms. Patterson, you have no legal grounds for enforcing this ban. Do you have any justification for your actions?" Karen leaned forward. "Your Honor, service dogs are disruptive to the community. It's unfair to allow one person to break the no-pet rule." The judge raised an eyebrow. "Are you arguing that federal law is unfair?" Karen stammered. I just think HOAs should have more control over who." The judge cut her off. "That's enough. This court finds the HOA in direct violation of federal law. The violation notice is officially nullified." Then he looked back at me. "As for damages, how much are you seeking?" Karen's smirk disappeared instantly. The massive lawsuit, the HOA's worst nightmare. I wasn't just suing to get rid of the violation. I was suing for damages. And not just a small amount. I had documented emotional distress from being harassed over my disability, legal fees incurred from the case, public discrimination that had affected my ability to enjoy my home. And since the HOA had refused to comply with federal law multiple times, I requested $250,000 in damages. Karen's face turned ghost white. The HOA lawyer whispered something to her. Then the judge said, Given a clear violation of federal law, I find the requested damages reasonable. The HOA will pay the plaintiff $250,000. Karen jumped up from her seat. What? That's outrageous. The judge glared at her. You should have followed the law, Ms. Patterson. Karen tried to argue again, but the judge shut her down. This case is over. The HOA is fined, the dog stays, and you, Ms. Patterson, are personally banned from holding any HOA leadership position ever again. That was it. Karen had lost everything. Her HOA power? Gone. Her legal fight? Over. Her reputation? Destroyed. And it was entirely her own fault. The aftermath, Karen faces the consequences. After the ruling, the HOA board turned on Karen immediately. They blamed her for the $250,000 fine that drained their finances, the public scandal that made national news, the federal lawsuit that nearly got the HOA dissolved. At the next HOA meeting, Karen was officially removed from the board. And as she stormed out, someone called out, "Guess you should have read the law, Karen." She slammed the door behind her and never came back. The community celebrates when new beginning. With Karen gone, the HOA made several major changes. The no-pet policy was permanently revised to allow service animals. The HOA board was required to attend disability law training. A new rule was passed stating that any major HOA decision must comply with federal law, no exceptions. And the neighborhood was finally free. Baxter and I could walk through the streets without fear. No fines, no harassment, no ridiculous nonsense. Just peace. And Karen, she had become a cautionary tale. The story of the HOA president who thought she was above federal law spread across online HOA forums. She was now the face of what happens when an HOA gets too much power. And the best part, she would never be in charge of anything again. Karen had lost everything. Her position in the HOA? Gone. Her power over the neighborhood? Destroyed. Her plan to bully me into removing my service dog? Backfired spectacularly. But instead of accepting defeat gracefully, she went into full meltdown mode. And her next moves will be some of the most pathetic, desperate, and downright hilarious acts of revenge I had ever seen. Karen tries to rally support. It goes terribly wrong. A few days after the court ruling, Karen did something so predictable, it was almost funny. She started a petition to overturn the corrupt court decision. She went door to door, ranting about how the HOA had been unfairly targeted and how I was manipulating the system. Her petition was an absolute joke. It read, "We demand justice. The HOA should be allowed to enforce rules without government interference. Sign here to support the fight against outsiders ruining our neighborhood." Her goal? Get at least 100 signatures to pressure the HOA into reinstating her. The reality? She got 6, and 3 of them were from her own family. Neighbors slammed doors in her face. Some laughed and told her to move. One homeowner, an elderly woman named Mrs. Thompson, literally sprayed her with a garden hose when she wouldn't leave the porch. Karen stormed off dripping wet, screaming that she would be back with lawyers. She never came back. Karen's next move, fake violation notices. When her petition failed, Karen tried something even more desperate. She started printing fake HOA violation notices and stuffing them into people's mailboxes. The notices looked real at first glance, but they had one big problem. She didn't have access to the HOA letterhead anymore. So instead, she printed them on regular printer paper and signed them. Karen L. Patterson, concerned resident. One of the fake violations read, "Notice of noncompliance. Your lawn has exceeded acceptable height standards. Please correct this violation within 3 days or face fines." The funniest part, the HOA no longer had any lawn height restrictions. She was so desperate to stay relevant that she was making up rules that didn't exist. Someone reported her, and the HOA sent out a mass email warning residents to ignore any notices not officially stamped by the board. And just like that, Karen's fake fines were useless. But she still wasn't done. The neighborhood Facebook war. With no legal power left, Karen turned to Facebook. She created a new group called Save Our O and invited everyone in the community. Her posts were absolute gold. Our neighborhood has been taken over by people who don't respect the rules. If we don't fight back, this place will turn into chaos. First, they get rid of pet rules. What's next? Loud music? Junk cars? Anarchy. She tagged almost every resident. And the responses were brutal. Karen, please move. Nobody cares. Go away. You lost. Get over it. This is embarrassing. Within a few days, the group had 3 members. Karen, her sister, and some random guy who probably didn't know how to leave the group. Then, one of the HOA board members reported her for harassment. Facebook suspended her account. And just like that, her last attempt at control was gone. Karen tries one final act of revenge, and it blows up in her face. At this point, Karen was desperate. She couldn't force her way back into the HOA. She couldn't convince the neighborhood to support her. She couldn't even harass people online anymore. So she did something truly insane. She filed a complaint against me with the city. She claimed that my service dog was dangerous and a public nuisance. Her complaint read, "There is an aggressive dog in our neighborhood. It barks, lunges at people, and creates an unsafe environment." Now, let me be clear. Baxter is the most well-trained, calm, and gentle dog imaginable. He had never barked at a neighbor, never caused any damage, and never acted aggressively. But Karen was trying to get him legally removed from the neighborhood. She thought the city would just believe her. She had no idea that I had video footage from my security cameras showing everything. The city sent an investigator to check the complaint. When they arrived, I showed them footage of Karen harassing people, making fake fines, and going door-to-door screaming at residents. The investigator laughed. Then they said, "Yeah, we're dismissing this complaint. But if you'd like to file one against her, you have plenty of evidence." And that's exactly what I did. Karen gets a visit from the police. 2 weeks later, Karen got a knock on her door. It was a police officer holding a folder. "Ms. Patterson, we have reports that you've been harassing your neighbors and filing false complaints. If this continues, you may be charged with criminal harassment." Karen flipped out. She screamed that she was being targeted. She claimed the police were corrupt. She even tried to blame the HOA board. The officer didn't care. "This is your official warning. If we get another report, we'll take further action." Karen slammed the door in his face. And from that moment on, she finally shut up. The neighborhood's final victory, the Karen-free celebration. With Karen officially defeated, the HOA board decided to do something hilarious. They planned a neighborhood barbecue and named it the Karen-free celebration. They even sent out official invites that said, "Come celebrate the first month of our peaceful, Karen-free community. Enjoy food, games, and the relief of living without nonsense or drama." The entire neighborhood showed up. And Karen, she had to sit in her house, listening to laughter, music, and celebration from her window. She had gone from ruling the HOA to being completely ignored. And that was the worst punishment imaginable for her. The final nail in the coffin, Karen moves away. A few months later, Karen finally gave up. She put her house up for sale and left. And when the moving truck pulled away, the entire neighborhood stood outside and waved goodbye. One neighbor even played "Hit the Road Jack" on a speaker. It was the perfect ending to the worst HOA president in history. And the best part, Karen was never heard from again. Karen was finally gone. Her HOA dictatorship, over. Her fake fines, worthless. Her delusions of power, crushed. For the first time in years, the community was finally free. But what happened next was nothing short of amazing. Because without Karen lurking over everyone, the neighborhood transformed into something better than anyone could have imagined. The first change, the HOA's major reforms. The very first thing the new HOA board did, they rewrote the rules. Karen's reign had been defined by ridiculous regulations, unnecessary fines, and absolute power over the smallest details. But the new board, they were determined to undo all of it. So they held an emergency meeting and put forth 3 major proposals. In the ridiculous pet policy, service animals were officially protected in writing. Homeowners were now allowed to have pets, as long as they weren't disruptive. Eliminate Karen's fine-based dictatorship. No more excessive fines for minor violations. Every fine had to be reviewed by the board and voted on before being issued. Limit HOA power over personal property. Homeowners could now decorate, paint, and landscape as they pleased. The HOA could no longer issue demands for aesthetic control. And when they brought these new rules up for a community vote, it passed with 98% approval. Karen's entire legacy was erased overnight. The impact of Karen's absence, a community reborn. The effects of her removal were immediate. No more paranoia. People weren't afraid to check their mailboxes, wondering if they'd get a random fine. No more Karen patrols. Homeowners could park in their own driveways without fear of being towed. No more spying. Neighbors actually trusted each other instead of reporting every minor issue to the HOA. It was like the entire community had taken a deep breath for the first time in years. One neighbor, an elderly woman named Mrs. Thompson, said it best. "It finally feels like home again." And she wasn't the only one. People started talking, gathering, and actually enjoying the neighborhood. Without Karen wielding power over them, they could finally live in peace. The ultimate sign of change, the community celebration. To celebrate the new HOA era, the board planned a huge neighborhood event. They called it New Beginning Block Party. The invitation was hilarious. It read, "Join us for a celebration of freedom from HOA tyranny. No fines, no harassment, no clipboard-wielding nightmares. Just good food, great neighbors, and the joy of living Karen-free." And the event was legendary. The block party that changed everything. On the day of the event, the entire street was transformed. Barbecue grills lined the sidewalks. A live band played music. Kids ran around with balloons and face paint. Neighbors brought out lawn chairs and shared stories. And the best part, for the first time in a decade, everyone was happy. People who had never spoken to each other before were suddenly chatting like old friends. One man, who had been fined 6 times for unauthorized plants, walked up to me and shook my hand. "Man, I was ready to move out. But now, I actually like it here." And the HOA president, Greg, raised his drink and made a toast to a Karen-free neighborhood. May we never suffer under another HOA tyrant again. The crowd cheered. And at that moment, we all realized something. The neighborhood hadn't just survived Karen. It had become stronger because of her downfall. The new HO, a board that actually helped people. With Karen gone, the HO board actually started doing its job. Instead of punishing homeowners, they helped them. When a neighbor's fence broke, the HO organized volunteers to fix it instead of fining them. When a family struggled to maintain their yard due to illness, the HOA hired landscapers to assist instead of threatening penalties. When an elderly couple needed help with their driveway, neighbors actually pitched in without being forced to. For the first time in years, the HOA was actually a good thing. And the best part, nobody had to live in fear anymore. How I knew Karen was truly gone. One day, a few months after the lawsuit, I was walking Baxter down the street when a neighbor stopped me. "Hey, did you hear about Karen?" I raised an eyebrow. "Oh no, what now?" He chuckled and held up his phone. It was a screenshot from a Facebook group called Karen's New HOA Nightmare. Apparently, after leaving our neighborhood, Karen had moved into a different HOA community. And within weeks, she was already causing problems again. But this time, the HOA wasn't putting up with her nonsense. They fined her for breaking the same ridiculous rules she used to enforce on others. They denied her request to join the board. And when she tried to file another lawsuit, she lost again. She had gone from a power-hungry HOA dictator to a powerless nobody. And honestly, it was exactly what she deserved. The final legacy, Karen becomes a neighborhood legend. Over time, Karen's story became legendary. New homeowners moving in would hear, "This place used to be run by a Karen, but we took her down." And every year, on the anniversary of the lawsuit, someone would bring out the old HOA violation letters she used to send, and we'd all laugh about how ridiculous they were. Karen had tried to control the neighborhood. Instead, she became a cautionary tale, a reminder of what happens when an HOA gets too much power. And more importantly, a lesson in what happens when a community fights back. Because in the end, the neighborhood won, and Karen was just a bad memory. Karen's downfall wasn't just a victory for our neighborhood. It was a wake-up call for HOAs everywhere. Because what started as one power-hungry HOA president harassing a disabled homeowner turned into a legal battle that set a precedent across the country. And the impact would go far beyond one neighborhood. The media explosion, how the story went national. After Karen lost her lawsuit, our community thought that would be the end of it. But then, the story blew up. Local news stations had already covered the court case, but after the final ruling, it started gaining nationwide attention. Major news outlets picked it up with headlines like, HOA president loses $250,000 lawsuit after violating disability right. Service dog ban backfires. Homeowner sues OA and wins big. The HOA tyrant who thought she was above the law. The story spread like wildfire across social media, legal blogs, and disability advocacy groups. People were outraged that an HOA would even try to pull something like this. But what really got everyone talking? The lawsuit itself. Because when people realized that HOAs were being held accountable for violating federal law, they started fighting back. Other homeowners started challenging illegal HOA rules. Before my case, most homeowners believed HOAs could do whatever they wanted, that they could make up rules, enforce them however they pleased, and punish people with no consequences. But now, people knew better. Within weeks of my lawsuit making headlines, homeowners across the country started filing their own lawsuits against HOA boards that overstepped their authority, challenging ridiculous HOA fines using legal precedents from my case, pushing for new state laws that would limit HOA power. And the results were incredible. The legal domino effect. New HOA laws get introduced. Lawmakers began paying attention to the growing HOA abuse problem. They saw how many HOAs were run by power-hungry board members who thought they were above federal law. And as a result, several new laws were introduced across multiple states. HOAs were banned from restricting service animals. My case set a legal precedent, making it clear that no HOA could ever enforce a pet ban against service dogs again. Stronger protections for homeowners against HOA abuse. Many states passed laws limiting the fines HOAs could issue. Homeowners now had more legal options to fight back against unfair HOA policies. Mandatory HOA training on disability rights and fair housing laws. Some states began requiring HOA board members to complete legal training before they could enforce rules. For the first time in years, HOAs were being forced to follow the law. And it all started because Karen tried to get rid of my service dog. How my lawsuit became a case study in legal courses. A few months after the ruling, I got an unexpected email from a law professor. It read, I wanted to reach out to let you know that your case has been added as a case study in our property law curriculum. Your fight against the HOA has become an important legal example of homeowners' rights and disability law. Thank you for standing up and making a difference. I was stunned. What started as a petty HOA dispute had turned into a landmark case in property law. And the best part? Law students across the country would now learn from Karen's mistake. She wanted to make an example out of me. Instead, she became the example. Across the country start changing their rules. After my case went public, HOA boards across the country started scrambling. They knew they could no longer get away with making illegal rules. And within a year, thousands of HOAs revised their policies to remove blanket pet bans that violated federal law, create clear guidelines for service animals to prevent future lawsuits, ensure their rules aligned with ADA and Fair Housing Act requirements. One HOA president even emailed me personally saying, I was about to enforce a similar pet policy in my community, but after reading about your lawsuit, I realized we were in the wrong. Thanks for standing up. You saved a lot of homeowners from dealing with the same nonsense. Karen's plan backfired so badly that she didn't just lose control of her own HOA. She ended up forcing every HOA to rethink their power. Meanwhile, where was Karen? While HOAs across the country were dealing with the fallout from my lawsuit, Karen was dealing with a disaster of her own. Because after she lost her house and moved to another HOA community, she tried to run for the HOA board there. And guess what? They laughed her out of the election. One resident later told me. She tried to make a speech about restoring order. Someone in the crowd shouted, "Didn't you get sued for breaking federal law?" And the whole room erupted in laughter. She lost by a landslide. Karen had gone from an HOA tyrant to a joke that nobody took seriously. She would never hold power again. The final victory, a letter from a fellow veteran. One day, I received a handwritten letter in the mail. It was from a fellow disabled veteran who had heard about my story. It read, "I wanted to personally thank you for what you did. I've had my own struggles with an HOA trying to enforce illegal rules against me. But after reading about your case, I was able to challenge them and win. You didn't just fight for yourself. You fought for all of us." I sat there for a long time, holding that letter. Because in the end, this wasn't just about Karen. It was about every homeowner who had ever been bullied by an out-of-control HOA. And now, they knew they could fight back and win. Karen's legacy, a cautionary tale for HOA boards everywhere. Karen had tried to control everything. She thought she was above the law. She believed that HOA rules mattered more than federal regulations. But now, she was a cautionary tale. Her story was told in legal courses, disability rights seminars, and HOA meetings nationwide. Her name became a warning. Anytime an HOA tried to enforce ridiculous rules, someone would bring up Karen's lawsuit, and the board would back off. She had set a precedent. Just not the one she wanted. Karen's downfall had sent shockwaves through the HOA world. Her name became infamous in homeowner associations, legal studies, and online HOA forums. She had tried to rule with an iron fist and ended up being remembered as the woman who single-handedly lost a $250,000 lawsuit by ignoring federal law. But while my community moved on, thriving without her, Karen's life was an absolute shambles. Karen's new reality, a life without power. After she lost the lawsuit, was removed from the HOA, and became a neighborhood pariah, Karen had no choice but to move away. She sold her house at a loss since no one wanted to buy a home with a history of HOA corruption, and within a few months, she relocated to a new neighborhood, another HOA community. Because of course she did. But this time, things were different. She wasn't the one in charge anymore. And when she tried to run for the HOA board in her new neighborhood, it backfired spectacularly. Karen's humiliating HOA election loss. In her new community, Karen assumed she could regain power. She started attending HOA meetings, loudly voicing her expertise on rule enforcement and neighborhood order. Then, after only 3 months, she officially announced her candidacy for the HOA board. And what happened? It was an absolute disaster. At the first candidate forum, someone stood up and said, "Wait, aren't you the Karen who lost a huge lawsuit for illegally trying to ban a service dog?" Karen froze. Another person laughed and added, "Yeah, I read about that online. You lost your entire HOA position, didn't you?" Within minutes, the entire crowd was talking about her past. By the time the election results came in, Karen had received a grand total of 3 votes, and 2 of them were probably from her own family. She had gone from HOA tyrant to an outcast nobody took seriously, and she would never hold power again. Meanwhile, back in our neighborhood, while Karen was embarrassing herself in a new community, our neighborhood was thriving. The new HOA board had completely reformed the association into something fair and reasonable. No more ridiculous fines. No more power-hungry board members. No more spying and rule-enforcing patrols. People actually liked living there again. And for the first time in years, neighbors started doing things they hadn't done before. Kids could play outside without fear of noise complaints. People actually helped each other instead of reporting each other to the HOA. Homeowners no longer had to worry about getting fined over nonsense. It was a complete transformation. And the best part? Nobody missed Karen. The final celebration, a Karen-free anniversary party. 1 year after Karen was removed from the HOA, someone in the neighborhood had a brilliant idea. We should throw an anniversary party. Not just any party. A Karen-free anniversary celebration. The entire neighborhood loved the idea. They printed invitations that read, "1 year ago, we defeated the tyrant. Join us in celebrating 1 full year of peace, sanity, and no ridiculous HOA fines. No clipboards allowed. And the event was legendary. Barbecue pits were set up on multiple streets. A dunk tank was rented, with a dummy labeled HOA Tyrant. One neighbor even made t-shirts that said, "I survived a Karen." And the funniest part, someone brought a framed photo of Karen's old HOA violation letters, and we set them on fire in a ceremonial goodbye Karen moment. It was the perfect send-off. Karen had ruled it like a dictator. Now, she was nothing but a bad memory. The lawsuit's final impact of a lasting victory. Even though Karen was long gone, her mistakes continued to benefit homeowners everywhere. Thanks to my lawsuit, HOAs across the country revised their rules to comply with federal law. More homeowners stood up against HOA abuse, using my case as a precedent. Lawmakers introduced new regulations to limit HOA overreach. And for the first time ever, HOAs had to be careful about enforcing rules. Because if they stepped out of line, they could be sued. Just like Karen. The final word on Karen. What happened to her? As for Karen, she never fully recovered. After her embarrassing election loss, she tried moving again, but by then, her name was too infamous. Every time she tried to join another HOA board, someone would Google her name and find a lawsuit. She was officially blacklisted from power. One person even sent me a screenshot of Karen ranting in a Facebook group for displaced HOA leaders. Her post? HOAs are under attack. We must fight back against homeowners who think they can do whatever they want. The comments roasted her. Lady, you lost a $250,000 lawsuit. Maybe take the L and move on. Aren't you the Karen who got laughed out of an HOA election? You literally became a meme. Give it up. Karen had gone from ruling an entire neighborhood to being an internet joke. And honestly, it was exactly what she deserved. The final reflection, a battle worth fighting. Looking back, I realized that fighting back against Karen wasn't just about my service dog. It was about standing up for every homeowner who had ever been bullied by a power-hungry HOA. And in the end, we won. Karen thought she was untouchable, but she learned the hard way that no one is above the law. And now, HOAs everywhere knew they couldn't just make up rules and expect people to follow them. Because if they tried, they'd end up just like Karen, defeated, humiliated, and completely powerless. The true lesson: a community united will always win. Karen believed she could control everything. That her HOA position made her invincible. That nobody could challenge her. But in the end, a single lawsuit destroyed everything she built. Because when a community stands together, even the worst HOA tyrant can be taken down. And Karen, she will forever be remembered as the woman who lost everything over a service dog.